need to know. This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical advice, and it does not create a doctor-patient relationship. Always talk to your own physician before making any changes to your health, medications, or treatment plan. Every question, every claim, we break it down, we keep it sane. From the labs to the front line, modern medicine every time. Modern medicine, let's begin!
Hi everyone, Dr. Ted Shivey here from our podcast on modern Michigan medicine. I'm here with my friends, Dr. Robert Zayed, my long-term colleague of 18 years, sat side by side with him over these last 12.5 years, and Victor Ferris, accomplished physician, family medicine, sports certified. So we're going to tackle a topic today that's near and dear to all of our hearts, and that is truth consequences. When I was a kid, there was a Memorex commercial. They would play a sound, and was it real or was it Memorex? And many of you may not remember that because I'm a little bit older. But the thing is, things have come along a lot in the last couple of years as to how do you believe? What's the truth? Is it in fact real or is it fake? And we're going to talk about how you as a patient, specifically with regard to the field of medicine, can help discern whether what you're hearing from the internet and influencers, how do you pick your advisor? How do you decide whether or not something is worth following or is actionable in your life, or whether it needs to be discarded? So let's start there. A complex topic. Bob, let's start it off. As far as this is concerned, how do you pick your advisors these days? How do you decide whether something is worth investigating even further?
You know, I think we have a huge benefit for many reasons. You know, we've been able to talk to a lot of people over the years. Every day in the exam room, we see 30 people with different personalities. We know how they laugh, how they cry, how they think about things. We've looked at many articles. We know how a good article that's well prepared with data looks like, what a p-value, what significance means. And we've lived through an evolution of technology where we saw things from Prodigy and AOL, that put out news for you that was vetted, to now AI-produced content that even like local news agencies will use over a real human reporter. So I think those, if you go back to like Malcolm Gladwell, slices have helped us to discern what is true or not. From my patterns, I typically get pushed away from somebody that is saying something and juxtaposed to a sales event, where they're saying, hey, you must take this supplement to help you, and we have some mechanism that this thing works on, and then they loosely connect it to an outcome and say, well, for $29.99, you can buy this supplement. So that right there is like one of the flags I look at. It might take the whole hour for me to look at every flag, but I think those little things sometimes come in from experience. I would say experience is the big thing that I use to determine who my influencers are.
So what I hear from you is that somebody's credentials, their credibility is important, and whether or not you trust it. There was a time when what was in the news was probably vetted. The reporter went to an editor, went to a senior editor. Before it hit print, it had gone through several verification episodes. So, Vic, in today's AI world of everybody can publish anything, how is that affecting you and your patients as you come to believe as to they come with preconceived notions about what they want to have or what medicines they will or will not take? How are you handling that?
Yeah, that's a very, very good topic, and a very kind of hard topic to breach. I think what it boils down to, Ted and Bob even, is the source. Where is this information coming from? And just like we had alluded to with AI, I mean, not everything that AI expresses in an answer on whatever AI platform you're using is actually accurate. And I think part of the reason has to do with how that information is sourced. Not all, AI, as it stands right now, typically scours the internet for the information or the query that you're trying to find out for, and it gets things that are from reputable sources, and it also extracts things that may not be from a great reputable source. Could be from a platform, a Reddit or Discord or somebody's opinion, and that may be perceived in an AI answer as being truth or fact, and that's the hurdle that us as physicians need to help navigate. And I think the most important thing is understanding the source. Where is this information coming from, and is that source reputable? And that's the way I approach it. Whenever a patient comes and tells me I read something, I love it. Number one, it's my opportunity to have a discussion with my patient. Number two, it's my opportunity to learn something possibly, and even try to dispel some rumors. And what I try to do is, first thing I do when somebody says, hey, I read something, where did you read it from? Where did you get that information from? If you're telling me that my wife's cousin's aunt's uncle's brother's cousin tried this and told me this before, okay, we can have a discussion about it. It may not be the most reputable source, but we can definitely have a discussion about it. But if you're telling me that you obtained information about a certain drug or a certain course of therapy or a certain condition that you think that you may have, and it came from Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, MD Anderson, University of Michigan, NIH, CDC, these, I feel, tend to have more reputable sources. They've obtained their information through rigorous vetting, like Dr. Shavli had mentioned. And I think that I'm more apt to believe and have them as a reputable source than I would be from another avenue.
And Vic, like what you bring up is scientific discovery. Like when we first learned how to write a paper, one of the most important things was putting references for every fact you have in there, right?
Yes.
So when you look for a reference, that's been part of science for 100 years. It could still be applied in this case. The thing I would add to that is somebody could make something look like it came from a CDC or a World Health Organization, and it could be fabricated and it didn't really come from their mouth. And so one of the quick things people can do is if it looks like it's a accusation that just doesn't make sense, or even if it does, you could always Google that and go to the actual website. So even when it looks like a source that you should maybe pay attention to, like it's, you feel like, Novi City Hall produces good information. Well, go to Novi City Hall's webpage and just make sure that it actually is on their website. Yeah. Verify the source, right?
Or you hear something on the news about a claim that's made about health. Go to that website, read up on it, see where they cited their sources, see what type of vetting was done of that information before it was released to the general public. And sometimes you may be surprised that it's a very reputable source and it's good information. And sometimes you may look at it and it may raise your eyebrows a little bit to think that this may not be it may not be pertaining to me or my patients as much as I thought it would be.
So to the point you're making, Vic and Bob, is there's no dearth of information out there. There's a lot of information. A lot of it comes with passion and enthusiasm and an agenda. The trouble is our ability to filter that, our ability to sort of discern what's true and what's not. And so we'll take this discussion, I think, is trying to find out what truth is and how to be as a consumer, as a patient, how to be more interested in what's right as opposed to the information being presented there. One way in which that's done is to verify sources, as you said. So looking at the underlying source documents for that. And Bob, to the point, it's not difficult for the average person to actually find out from Google or AI or others what an original source is. But I wonder whether most people physicians included, don't really look at the headlines without actually looking at how that conclusion was actually generated. The process. I think we should be, as physicians and as trusted sources for our patients, to be a little more discerning than just the sound bite. How did that information get derived? How many people were in the study? How was it conducted? So talk about that for a minute. The soundbite oftentimes can be somewhat misleading. 30% of our patients did this. Well, 30% of what exactly?
Right. I mean, we see it all the time. You know, you could have an antibiotic that has been on the market for 50 years and treated things perfectly. And then, you know, a news agency, this happens through our career, says that antibiotic can cause like a fatal arrhythmia in the heart. Well, truth is that was probably a known risk for many years, but then you find out that later on a new antibiotic came out to take its place. So sometimes there's more to the story. Or you'll have like a better example would be, you know, some kind of study that had a very low number of people that were in it that showed some relation but not causation, you know. So they'll put on the news sometimes, hey, you know what, we found that people that do this take this certain medication have this kind of a side effect, but they didn't actually look to see that the data doesn't prove that.
And so Bob mentioned relationship versus causation, Vic. For the average patient out there, what are we talking about when we talk about association, relationship versus cause and effect?
I think,
and
yeah.
in biology, I'll just throw this out there, I think it's a lot more difficult to be dogmatic about cause and effect.
For sure.
Math, you can do a theorem and you can prove that A equals B. But in biology, there's so many other factors involved. It becomes a lot more difficult to be absolutely certain. We have a theory, we have a model, but to get to truth is difficult.
You know, one thing we always tell patients is nothing in medicine is 100%. And so causation and relation are two interesting ways to talk to patients about certain topics. I think causation would be, you know, trying to make a direct connection between what you're doing versus the outcome that's there, and seeing whether or not there's a causal effect there. Where relation could just be, you know, hey, like Dr. Zayed had mentioned, you take an antibiotic and maybe you get, maybe you get some symptom or you feel warm, or something happens, but you're not running a fever, and that may be a relationary type of situation where maybe the medication you're taking is having an effect, and that is causing a certain situation to arise in you, but it may not be directly related. It may not be that you take this medication and it causes you to have an elevated temperature. It could be that any antibiotic that you take could have an elevated, could make you feel warm, and that would be more of a relation type of situation more than a causation. So I think it's important, just like Dr. Shadley mentioned, to kind of discern, you know, what's directly related to what you're discussing versus where there could be some ambiguity, where there could be some gray area. And that's the hard part of medicine is, like I said, nothing is 100% in medicine. And so when we approach these topics, we really try to not overcommit, I think I would say, to because if you do overcommit to a patient, sometimes that could become very emotional to them, and sometimes there are topics where it may not be taken internally as well. So trying to discern what's real and what's not is really hard. And I think going back to the source again and trying to look at data, looking at the studies, that's the most important thing. And we hear a lot of doctors talk about that, looking at studies and looking at this and looking at that, and it's true. That's how we practice. Whenever we see a patient, we're never making a decision, at least I'm not, making a decision based on how I feel. Every decision I make is based on some form of data that I've ascertained throughout my career, some article that I've read, some study that I've looked at, some book that I've read that actually outlines your condition and what I think the best way to approach that condition is. And then we present it to the patient, and then they decide whether or not they want to accept that. So it's really just going back to the source, I think.
So what I hear you saying is we as primary care physicians have a unique opportunity to be able to distill a lot of scientific data and evidence and apply that to an individual person
Yes.
and their particular situation. And it's often sometimes confusing to the person as to whether that's just cause and effect or not. An example I use with my patients a lot is suppose the three of us over a couple of beers decide that riding in cars has caused heart attacks. So we go down and we survey 3 Detroit hospitals and we interview the next 500 people who have had a heart attack, and we say, "Sir or madam, did you happen to have ridden in a car within the 24 hours prior to your heart attack?" And we publish a study that says we've proven it. 98% of our patients with heart attacks have ridden in a car, and so cars cause heart attack. No. No. I mean, there's an association there, but that's a common thing, riding in cars.
Right.
Heart attacks are common, maybe not as common, but there's no necessary correlation, cause and effect type of a thing there. So we will, in this discussion today, talk a good bit about statistics and the scientific process a little bit. I don't mean to get too far into the weeds for that, but the average patient needs to know a little bit more about how we come to a conclusion about right and wrong. So if we're trying to decide whether A causes B, we would in science call that a hypothesis. We also want to know whether there's another possible explanation for A causing B. So we want to exclude all the other things that we can think of as a reason for that. So if we're developing a hypothesis, Bob, what kinds of things go into that consideration? A lot of it will be based on our observational. Over the first 500 million years I've been on the planet, we've evolved to think that this causes that. That's ultimately developed into this scientific process.
Yeah, and so it's a great question. Typically when we all look at a study, we're looking for certain things. You look at an N. N is the number of people in the study, because if the 3 of us did a study and one of us had something that was just an outlier, that could really skew the results. But if you have 10,000 people or 100,000 people in the study, you're a lot more likely to have significance. The other thing is you don't want bias, right? You don't want to give a treatment to half of the group and not to the other half of the group, and then have the people that are getting the treatment, knowingly getting the treatment, think that they're supposed to have some outcome that's predetermined, because our brains are wonderful, but they really can affect outcomes. So we call that blinded study. So, we want no bias, we want it to be blinded, we want enough numbers, and then we want to eliminate confounding variables. That's the thing you said. Well, so if you're testing for that heart attack for that patient, maybe it wasn't the car, but if you're trying to look at whether or not cholesterol affected their heart attack, well, if you had a bunch of diabetics in there and all of them had heart attacks, is it really the cholesterol or was it the sugar? So you kind of want to do some studies that have pretty uniform patients, and then follow-up studies that look at segments of the population. So a really well-done study will do that. And then I think the last thing for me, is it repeatable? Can you do the same study in a different country, in a different demographic, and get similar results? And then ultimately, if this was funded by a pharmaceutical company, or if it was funded by somebody that was against something, I might be a little bit cynical, because
Might be.
Right. Well,
I'm fully accountable for that.
yeah, that's okay. I'll give you credit. But if you're looking at, something that's proving, every study can change behavior, and changing behavior can generate income. And so if somebody is proving something that benefits their own company, to me, that's a bias that I usually overlook, and I want to see an independent body. I would love it if we had a government body or an independent body that we all trusted that just did all studies, but that's not the way the world works. So you have to look at that bias.
So bias is a critical piece to this whole thing. So I think we have a tendency to trust organizations whose belief system seems to resonate with ours, whether it's a political party or a religious organization or a scientific one. Yeah, so it'd be just, I think, aware that we, as humans, like to be certain. We like to say this is true.
Yes.
It can be difficult, I would suggest, for us to live with the fact that I don't know, or it might not always be true, and that affects our thought process as we start to question, is it in fact absolute, or is it just a relative type of a thing?
Definitely something to consider when you're having that discussion. Yeah, I would agree. I think looking at how our own personal bias and how we obtain that information has a lot to do with what you do as well. Do you are you in the mindset of a certain type of if you have a certain way of thinking, do you typically choose one source over another? Do you believe one source over another? And so I really think that as physicians, our job is to delineate what's truth and what's not true. And the way that we do that for us is multitudes. I think we obtain information from a multiple range or a multiple source. And that's where, as physicians, our reference guides are really helpful. I know not to plug them, but a lot of physicians nowadays are using what we call open evidence, which is a service to kind of for doctors to look up information. And the reason that I like it is that when you gain a topic of information from something like open evidence or another sources up to date, it references multiple citations. And that helps kind of strengthen the argument that they're making to you with the delivery of the information that they're giving to you. If they're telling you that X, Y, and Z occurs, they're basing it off of certain articles and certain data that have been read and kind of formulated to the answer that you're looking for. So multitude of sources, I think, would be helpful for us as well.
I'm going to tease something out right here. I like what you said. Open evidence is AI, right? Mm-hmm. It is looking at research from strong bodies and a ton of research. So is Open AI more of a scientist than Gemini, Grok, ChatGPT, and Claude?
I don't think it's more of a scientist, but what I think it's doing is it's
has better sources.
Has better sources because Gronk and Gemini and all the other ones are scouring the internet for anything.
Okay, so I'm going to tease that. So here's the thing. Again, this goes back to where we started. It's all about the source.
It's reputable sources.
So I've been playing around with AI a whole lot. And right now, AI is taking information and it's stealing information from everybody. We created a website on our urgent care for Cyclospora because a couple of weeks ago we had an outbreak in Michigan. And it's got good information because we put it there. But AI took our information. If you search Cyclospora and Novi, it quotes us from our website. But I don't think Google AI or Gemini or whatever they call it is actually vetting that against research. I could have put down that Cyclospora and had some misleading facts or said we're the premier place to treat cyclospora, and it might have picked that up.
Or you can say it came from lettuce.
Right.
And that can be complete. It was the thought process by the CDC, but it's been debunked. So you're right. It's the source. It's identifying the source of where
It's getting its
where you're getting information from.
So Bob, I fully acknowledge you're further down the AI channel than I am, but I understand from what I've read anyway that you can make these AI engines be more truthful if you do certain coaching to them about being human and truthful and red zone and things like that. Can you talk about a little bit how can you make the AI engine not, the word is I guess hallucinate, when the AI agent just sort of dreams up an answer that they think you want to hear?
Right.
You know, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Like, you know, there's something called EEAT, and this is the authority. You can tell a search engine that you're a doctor, that you're a Novi, that you're a primary doctor, that you have these authorities, and the search engine will then look at your website a little bit different. It's called EEAT. But that is assuming that everybody that's entering EEAT is being truthful. Even if you don't say you're a physician, you could say that you're an authority on peptides or an authority on you name it, right? So then when you're talking to the AI, you can put guardrails in your prompts, but I still have seen where it can hallucinate, and I would still double check what you see from it. I agree with Dr. Vic. There are, like, when you look at legal and medical, there are some engines now that they're developing that are using, the only information it gets is the information that's been inputted from vetted sources. Some of the language models that are open to the public are not as specific at this point. So you just have to be careful. I don't think you can put the right prompt in there that will 100% guarantee you that it's going to be accurate information.
And so these AI agents are in fact searching the total body of human knowledge as to what the world should look like. And again, from what I read, I'm not an expert on this area of it, but over the years, many sci-fi movies have talked about robots taking over the world, that the artificial intelligence will be cruel and inhumane and things like that. It's the AIs have read all of that stuff and have sort of assumed maybe that's the way they're supposed to be. Challenging that body of evidence can be quite a challenge. There was a Hungarian physician, his name was Ignaz Semmelweis, 19th century Hungarian physician, who challenged the leading theory of the time, which was marasma, that these vapors, these evil vapors, were the cause of most diseases, and that people would get these diseases sort of en masse in a certain area. He was a physician, and he came to wonder whether it wasn't the physicians going from the autopsy lab straight to childbirth causing these puerperal or childbirth fevers that were killing people. He challenged it, and he was ostracized. You were going against the stated theory of the time. He was ridiculed. He ended up in an insane asylum.
Wow.
And died, coincidentally, of the same kind of fever. He struggled hard. Only later, only centuries later, did his idea of sanitation actually become the norm when Pasteur and others developed the germ theory, which replaced marasma. But that took a century of data to get to the point where the standard belief system was modified.
I think what we're doing now with the advent of the internet and AI is the dogma of having or questioning the social or the norms, like this physician that you're talking about, Dr. Shively. Back in his day, going against the structure of medicine, he would be ostracized because people felt that was what worked and what was beneficial for their practice. Now, with the advent of the internet and how information is shared, those dogmas have been broken down because you can easily disprove or prove based on multiple sources. And I think going back to that is kind of the key there, is really looking at multiple sources to try to ascertain, because just like what Dr. Zayed has said, when you're looking at a sample size, if you have 3 people and you say 30% of the people have X, Y, and Z, well, that's one person out of the 3. But if you say 30% of 10,000 people have X, Y, and Z, you tend to have more confidence in the answer, more confidence that may be a real possibility. And so using multiple sources, I think, is the key to dispel any misinformation.
And don't forget fear. Sometimes the truth does not come out because of someone else's bias. When you tell me that story of the pathologist, I'm thinking, well, why would somebody not want to believe that if that could help those mothers with childbirth? And maybe they didn't have the answer of how you prevent this marasma. And really, at the end of the day, I think we'd all agree it probably was some skin-to-skin contact of an infection that was transferred. But either way, he was onto something, right? So if the hospital agreed that the pathologist moving to the childbirth stage caused this, and now people didn't trust the hospital to have childbirth, they would lose money, right? And I hate that works that way, but a lot of times the truth is suppressed because, it's simple. Just give them soap. Wash your hands, right? We know that now, but at the time, if they actually concluded that those two actions happened together, I'd love to know what they were thinking about why they put him in an insane asylum. They're like, we're going to hide you because you're not good for our business, right?
He proved that the childbirth infection rate dropped from 38% to, I think, a single-digit number. You have to fact-check that for me. But he proved that it was washing their hands with chlorinated lime was reducing these infections. But he was basically taking on the medical establishment, and they didn't like it. And to the point we're making about multiple sources. Up until fairly recently, your cohort, the people that you associated with, your colleagues and your family and your small community were the sources of truth for you. Then came the printing press and newspapers, and things got disseminated, and now we have the internet, in which anything happening anywhere in the world will be potentially on my feed in about a minute. So where we're getting our sources of truth is a lot of it's no longer truly verifiable. If I've lived in the same community with you for the last 30 years, I have an idea about your trustworthiness, and if you say that it's true, and I've come to believe over the years that I don't question that so much. So the point that we're making is finding a way to verify that. A lot of it has to do with a trust factor that has become somewhat tainted with the ability for anybody to publish anything as truthful.
So I'm going to take this, you're making me think here a little bit. So if your pathologist was correct but didn't have a study behind him, how can we parallel that today with people that are claiming certain peptides can do things or ivermectin can do things? And truthfully, maybe there hasn't just been strong enough studies to prove it positive, but there also might not be studies that prove it negative. How do we navigate that in a society that wants everything now when there could be potential risk? I know people want this BPC 550, for example, but one of the side effects is angiogenesis, the growth of blood vessels, which to me, I can't be certain that doesn't come with also the growth of cancer.
Right. So
I can't tell you for sure it's going to cause cancer, but I also can't tell you that it won't, right? And so, as a steward of science and evidence, I probably will be a little bit later to the game to do it. Now, people that are taking it, it's possible one of two things happen. it actually never shows that it causes cancer, and the people that took it got some benefit from it, or they study it one day and it causes cancer. I can't at this juncture, with the kind of studying we've done and what we're representing to patients, advocate for it. So I kind of sit on the fence when it comes to questions like that. Now if I know for sure it causes a risk, I'm going to also express it. So how do you guys handle that, right? Because that's one of those gray areas.
Yeah, it's very tough. That's extremely tough.
So we're basically working our way down through the Bradford Hill criteria for whether something's verifiable or not. And that first thing is the strength of the evidence. We talked about that, the N number. If it's 1 out of 3, totally different thing than if it's 300 out of 3 million or 300,000.
Sure.
So is it in fact sort of something that has been repeated several times? And then is it in fact reproducible? Is if it was done in your lab, can you duplicate that in that lab? Is it if it's true in white people, is it true in black people? If it's true in males, is it true in females? We did this is that slicing that you're talking about in terms of Gladwell. If this may be true for this population, but not that. So we're looking for, if we're honest, we're looking for the truth, as opposed to a soundbite of this is always true. We want that, but it's very rare in health and medicine and biology as a rule that something is true in all circumstances.
I think a way to approach that is making sure that you have that discussion with your patient. I mean, going back to Dr. Zayed's example, if you have something that you may not know the end result, it's just having an open conversation with a patient. Look, here's what the data says. Here's the way I feel. Here's what I think you may benefit from. And then have an open discussion. And look, I mean, modern medicine is not definitive in any way, shape, or form. But having open conversations with patients and discussing their concerns and using data to help expel some of the misinformation that they have and using data to help strengthen some of the information that you're presenting to them is really the most important way to move forward so that everybody feels comfortable. I mean, when I present with a treatment strategy for a patient, I want them to feel comfortable that this is the best way to move forward for them. And that has to do with reading information and reading sources and dispelling rumors and even coming back to what Dr. Zayed said, kind of what his feeling is. If he thinks that, if he knows that a medication may cause angiogenesis and that, based on his medical data, that angiogenesis may predisposed to other problems and maybe develop into a cancer of some sort because he knows the underlying pathophysiology of how angiogenesis works. It may not be a causal relationship, but there could be some concern that he has. And ultimately that would be projected to the patient, and the patient can make the decision if they want to assess that risk and assume it. So it's tough. It's tough.
That's, I think, part of what establishes us as a trusted source of information, where we are willing and able to discuss the pluses and the minuses of a particular kind of a treatment and have a mutually shared discussion with our patient about the benefits and risks of a certain procedure, whether it's a medication or a treatment plan or a vaccination. My feeling is that for my people, if they're dug in, they're not interested in more information and have a certain belief set, probably a waste of my time to talk about alternative therapies. My mom would say a man, true for a woman too, a man convinced against his will is of that same opinion still. They may be bulldozed into saying yeah, but they didn't actually come away with any change in their overall thought process. So if you want a treatment, and I think it's appropriate, let's do that. If you don't want it and you're dug in, I think the discussion's over. And where we have value as primary physicians is to sort of help you decide whether this is appropriate for you, whether this is applicable to your particular situation.
I think a lot of that topic has to do with us as a situation of being a private practice.
Right.
I think us as in private practice, we're not beholden to larger institutions and the bureaucracy that can occur, and we can have those open and frank discussions with our patients more so than other physicians that are owned by certain companies and whatnot. So I and that's part of the reason that I wanted to do private practice, is because I was able to have the autonomy to have that discussion with the patient. We're not constrained in any way, shape, or form like a large institution that owns you would be. And so that's why I think our situation is ideal for patients that have concerns, because us having our own autonomy allows us to have those frank and sometimes difficult discussions with patients and not be blindsided with certain restrictions and certain policies that a larger institution may have. I think an open and frank discussion is the most important thing.
Just being aware of some influencers' agenda, whether they, like as Bob said, they're juxtaposing their belief system that A is good for you, and by the way, I'll sell it to you. That's a red flag. If your physician is beholden to a organization, and the best surgeon for you is, maybe that's not the right answer. So you have to just be aware we all have some biases and influences on our own thought process. As physicians, I think the independent physician is probably as immune as possible to those kind of biases that would influence the decision, because we all have a certain sense of belief. And I think it's important, once you find yourself, you're pretty certain of something, and that's maybe a time to be a little more, just as a scientist, to be a little more hesitant about, okay, so what are my underlying beliefs that's sort of making me not look at alternative explanations for that.
And it's, you guys are spot on. Vic, you've told me before, doctor means teacher. Mm-hmm. We're here to educate. We're here to teach. At the same token, we're bound by do no harm.
Right.
So do no harm means you wait, you research, you look, you observe, you talk, you teach. I've been blessed because of my first year of practice. 1 vaccine and 3 drugs got pulled off the market because they caused side effects that weren't expected. Even in the most studied medications, you don't know until they come out to market sometimes what they do in a greater population. So we've all been conditioned to kind of like wait and watch it. Someone who is not bound by do no harm, and none of us want to hurt the patient, first of all. We don't care about malpractice, but that's part of what we do. We don't want to do something that hurts a patient. We're not going to rush into a new peptide or an anti-parasite or something that isn't been studied. And I'll be the first to say, I'll put this out there. I also, when a new vaccine comes out, I'm careful. It's the same thing, just like the medications. When COVID came out, I was also a little bit careful with it. But when we looked at what was happening to people and what was available, there was a lot of people in the medical community that said, hey, this is the best we have to treat this disease that looked pretty bad. Right. Again, we were using the best information we had at the time, but I know in our office, there were conversations about it. Look, it's not been out that long. Here's what they have. It's a bad disease. Do you want to get it, right? It all comes down to looking at the data you have and how dangerous is the situation. For me, if I'm going to give something experimental or I'm going to give something that isn't yet vetted, there has to be a really good reason to do that, especially if there's harm towards the patient.
And to the point you're making, when something comes out, whether it's a new vaccine or a new medication, in many cases, the process by which that determination was made that this drug is good for this problem is made in a sort of a rarefied atmosphere. Your drug company will typically not want to have older people, people with diabetes. They want somebody who basically has just this particular condition, taking no other and then they'll get an approval for that only when it gets out into the real world, and your patient has also got 3 other medications and 4 other problems. Then we find out that it does cause this trouble in this situation. So again, that do not harm thing oftentimes involves a real, I think, legitimate hesitancy to not be first. A thing I like is that as a magician, I want to be able to reappear something before I've made them disappear. And we talked in another podcast about a new therapy that will use CRISPR to knock out a gene in your liver called the PSK9 inhibitor. Well, that is a permanent alteration in your DNA. And as far as I know, at the moment, this hasn't ever gone through all the trials yet. It's in phase 1 trials. But as far as I know, that's not reversible. So all of a sudden, I am now patient 2.0, and I don't know how to get back if it's bad.
Right.
I'm not going to be first on that thing. As another thing, if you're on the cutting edge, you often bleed.
You could bleed. Well, I mean, so didn't they? I think somebody was looking at a cure for sickle cell disease, right? And so if you fix sickle cell, it's great. You can go up in a mountain and breathe fine. But sickle cell, the reason why sickle cell exists is because the people who survived malaria in Africa had sickle cells that protected them from the infection they would get from those flies. And those were the ones that survived. So if you fix sickle cell without knowing that this is protecting them from malaria and you don't give them a treatment for malaria, you have a problem. Right? And so maybe that's correctable and it's not the same as like changing your gene for PSK9, but what is the unintended consequence of fixing something?
Good point. And just as a little aside, malaria came from melasma. It was originally thought to be a vapor type of thing. That's how it got its name.
Look at that. Everything's weaving together.
But yeah, but you're right. I mean, as physicians, we're sort of, this is the goal, but it's always good to ask the alternative question. It's always good, I think, in these AI searches to ask it, give me both sides of the argument. I mean, I don't want to just be spoon-fed what you think I want to hear. And I think from what I believe to be true, these AI agents are getting better about not just feeding you stuff that based on your profile they think you want to believe. So as physicians, we're interested in whether or not what we're recommending to patients are verifiable, that there's a large source of data for that we've looked at other alternatives, and if we're honest, the best we can say is based on our ability to ask all the questions, there's no better way to treat this than this at the moment. That may change. I think smart people with different data sets change their mind all the time. Like you can't imagine how hard it would be to be a politician and somebody trap out something that you said in 1985, and that's been 40 some years ago, and my mind. The data sets change, so we have to be honest with people and say we sometimes just don't know. This is the best we've got.
And you bring up a good point. We're like right in the middle of like a midterm, and sometimes politics will throw out information that is incorrect. Again, you have to ask, why would they do that?
Sometimes.
Why would they do that? Well, I know I'm being nice, but a lot of times I'm asking, why would they do that? And we know the answer. It's because they want to win. And sometimes you can't win just by being nice, right?
Right.
So when I look at news, I'm looking at both commentary networks, what the British say about us, what the Germans say about us. Because when you get multiple sources, like you said, Doc, give me both sides of the story. That's a great place to start. Because if AI could analyze what people are saying on the right versus the left, somewhere in between, you could use your mind to decide what makes more sense to you. And I would tell our audience, do that. Don't just look at one source, whether it's your politics, whether it's your science. If you get an email from a bank saying that you need to make a deposit, click on the from, don't click on the links, and look to see where it's coming from. call your bank with a phone number, not from the email, because somebody might be trying to get money from you that's outside of the country. And again, you got to ask, why would they send me an email like this? With all the fraud out there, your bank should not be asking you to sign into things from email. Just be careful with that stuff.
Right. So to sort of come to some wrapping up for the average patient looking at information that's out there, to try to decide whether it's verifiable, whether it's true for them, whether it's applicable to them. I think the average patient should be very cognizant, very much aware of where they're getting their information source. I would posit that most of the family physicians that I know out there have their patients' interest at heart. They've done a lot of reading. They're good at translating science into actionable data. But be aware that we also have our own biases about things as well. So when you're looking at data, is it coming from a verifiable source? You can, if you have the interest in verifying that those sources are in fact true, be very aware of somebody with an automatic red flag because their financial interests are tied to the outcome here. So if somebody is sort of looking at this thing as a sales approach, has a total different feel than if what I'm telling you comes from my honest belief. And I think people are good at discerning whether or not I feel this is the best thing for you or whether I feel like I'm sort of trying to sell you something. A lot of it's almost like a parent that says, hey, I read your story, we brushed your teeth, and you go to bed. and the kid will sometimes do that, you know.
I'm thirsty.
They have a body of evidence that says, I'm not trying to hurt you.
So I like your analogy, right? Could we like extrapolate that and say maybe physicians could be like parents, right? When you look at your kid, you want to protect them from things. You want them to get their own experience. You want them to learn from it. You just don't want them to make major mistakes. You want them to come to you and talk to you. So could we, we try to get away from the paternalistic approach in medicine where we just tell people what to do. And I think our office is very open where people were approachable, where people could talk to us about anything. Maybe instead of parent, it's like,
Advocate.
Yeah, or like cousin. Yeah. Can we be like cousins? We're like, come to me and talk to me. Tell me what you're reading. I am not ever bothered when a patient is reading about stuff. It creates discussion. But before you try something that you're not 100% sure of, maybe we can be that resource. We could be that soundboard, that credible source to you that can help you vet what you might perceive as true but might be false.
Yeah, to the point you're making, that parent analogy for a trusted source, but to the point you're making, paternal, like, do this because I said so. That doesn't fly in modern medicine. I think there should be an awful lot of, here's what I perceive to be your issue, your diagnosis, and here's my recommended treatment. Let's have a mutually shared discussion about whether that makes sense to you. What questions do you have? Let's get all your concerns out on the table before we decide. And very few things have I found in which I really have to put my foot down and dogmatic and say, no, if you do that, you're not only wrong, you're dangerous, and you're going to hurt somebody, or including yourself. And very rarely do I have to say, no, I can't, and I won't do that. It happens, but it's not. Yeah. More often than not, there's more than one way to skin the cat, as they say.
Yeah, and honestly, with an open, honest discussion, a lot of times people will come into the middle. Like in they may not give up everything that they want, but a lot of times they may, see your point of view a little bit better if it's not, pushed down your throat. I think part of why a lot of people during COVID, and I hate to keep on mentioning it, were a little bit irritated with some of the guidelines is because they were told they had to do it instead of saying, here's a good option we have right now, it's all we got. I think if you said, hey, this is a bad disease, we really don't know how to treat it, we do have a vaccine, we think it could help, you would have a line out the door.
To the point you're making, that dogmatic, this is the way to go, was not well received, and in fact, it's probably wrong, and it really left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths about the fact that our national leadership, who, I mean, I wasn't there and I don't honestly know, but I imagine they were pretty well compromised with what they were told to say, mandated to say, at the risk of losing a position. I'm not. That challenge to their credibility has, in fact, sort of descended down on each of us at the primary care level. So I'm not sure I believe you. I'm not sure you're as trustworthy as I thought you once were. That white coat thing isn't nearly as glowing white as it once was. It's been tarnished by our national leadership, who I think made mistakes in judgment for many reasons.
And made the argument that it was based on science. And that's the problem that left the credibility issue, particularly with the people at the higher ups. They were making those decisions during COVID. They were using the scientific model as truth when they were manipulating or potentially manipulating data and coming up with not recommendations based on science, but based on what they wanted to achieve politically, and using the science as a guide to try to achieve that. And that's not always the best thing for the patient population. I think that's why people feel that there's a credibility loss with science and whatnot. So it's going to take years to regain that. I think we're starting to. Mm-hmm. I think patients are starting to kind of have more trust in their doctors and in the people of medical authority. But I think there's still a long way to go. I
couldn't agree more. Things are starting to shift back to us as a medical profession having some better credibility. I do think even a person with just a sense of how the world works was recognizing early on that when that disease, COVID, was in multiple countries, we were never going to get herd immunity. Would you just please be quiet up there, because you're just making it worse, talking about how we're going to have herd immunity, just all wear masks and things like that. And we had good-hearted patients sewing us cloth masks because we were so unprepared for that. And now, it comes up again. The measles cases have risen dramatically in the last several months as our Health and Human Secretary has decided that some of the vaccinations that we have a law for evidence don't have the support of that people get sick is the thought. It sort of brings to question whether the medical establishment has enough authority and enough credibility with the public to challenge the political agendas that are interfering with some of those decisions.
And I think a couple things could be true at the same time. I think that, people that make drugs or vaccines can make a lot of money. They could have their own bias.
They have their own agenda.
And I think at the same time, disease can be bad. That could over time become less because you've had good treatments, where people might be looking at side effects they didn't look at before because they never saw a kid in an iron lung. People who don't want to immunize with polio haven't seen their generation or the generation before them with polio. But somebody who's 70 or 80 might have seen people who had polio before, right? And so what's sad for me is if, one interpretation of a company making a lot of money and them just pushing this down clouds the idea that polio could come back, or measles, and now you have kids that are paralyzed in the future. And I'm not one to push fear. I've actually kicked people out of our office that tried to sell us products based on fear. At the same time, sometimes when people start to disbelieve in science, I don't want this, but you almost need an outbreak at times to show people that it still exists. And if that outbreak never comes, then maybe we don't need the vaccine. So like I've become a little bit lukewarm with that. Here's the information, here's how it can protect you. I don't want to force anybody to do it. But if we get a lot of people that decide to go against science, it'll it has a way outside of whoever's in power to kind of reveal itself. It doesn't matter if a Democrat or Republican's in power. You stop doing something and the disease takes over, it will reveal its head.
I think it does come back to allowing for a more articulate patient-doctor mutually shared discussion about the benefits and risks of these kinds of diseases or therapies or immunizations. Like you said, very, very few people are alive today who have firsthand knowledge of what an iron lung did for people with a paralysis in their breathing system. That's pretty horrible. Does it make sense that everybody should be immunized? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you should have the ability to sort of decide for your own body, for your own children, whether or not this makes sense or not. But understand there's an agenda involved in that process as well, both from the manufacturer of the vaccine as well as the politics of autonomy.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good discussion. What else? Do we have anything else we want to add to this?
No, I think it's a fairly good summary of how science works, how hypotheses are developed and how the alternatives are excluded. Understand that in many cases in biology and medicine, the answer will be, it depends. We're not exactly sure this is the best we've got at the moment. I do think it leaves for room for the average patient to be very cognizant of where they're getting their information, what that trusted source is, and how they got to that conclusion. When data is presented, don't just look at the headlines, but look at how that process was developed, how many people were involved, how was the study run, and decide whether or not that thing makes sense in your particular, whether it's applicable to your particular situation. I think if more people did that, we would be all better off for the process.
And I'm going to encourage any of our patients listening to this to bring these discussions up to us in the room. With that being said, I also hope you guys enjoyed this. I ask you to subscribe to our podcast, share it with anybody that you think could be valuable with. And if you have ideas for future podcasts, please let us know. We are just starting, but you know what? If we get enough traction here, we'll keep it going. Have a wonderful Saturday, Sunday, weekday, whatever day you're watching this, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.